So, these are the three main boards that will be encountered throughout PC building. First we have the mini motherboard, we have the micro motherboard, and we have the ATX. There is an IPX where the back panel components are actually on the opposite side and all of the components are swapped around. And there is an EATX which has four 16 PCIe slots and usually has 8 RAM slots for mass gaming and video editing usually. So these two are Intel and this one is an AMD. So let's get into the differences. So as you can see, right away the easiest way to tell is on the AMD you usually have written right here AM3 Plus, AM4, something similar. However, the fans themselves, the heat sinks, are connected differently between the Intel and the AMD. The Intel, they are connected with 4 screws, usually twist pins here that you can twist and pop. The AMD is held by a crossbar that is hooked onto 2 hooks on the on a bracket which is connected to the board itself. To take that off, you usually just flip this one hook and you can remove it. So let's start removing. So let's start removing, and we'll take, all we need is a piece of tissue paper because we're going to have thermal paste to clear and thermal paste to replace. So let's start with the Intel. First we just need to twist and pop these 4 screws holding the heatsink on. Unplug the heatsink, remove dustly. As you can see, there is old thermal paste on both the heatsink and the CPU. Take some tissue paper, we'll remove the old thermal paste. Thermal paste itself is designed to create a better connection between the CPU and the heatsink, which allows for better heat dissipation. Okay, now to remove the CPU itself, on the Intel there's just a little hook here, brings up this bracket, and the CPU itself can be removed. Now the Intel CPU has metal dots on the actual CPU itself, and the pins are in the socket. When replacing the CPU, there is a small arrow on one side of the CPU itself. This correlates with a small arrow on the socket. The CPU also has two notches, one on either side of the CPU itself. This correlates with two tabs that are on the socket, so it can only go in one way. Once it's seated, close the frame and rehook. Now we add the thermal paste. A small dollop right in the centre is enough, as when the heatsink is pressed down, it will spread the thermal paste around. Now when replacing the heatsink itself, make sure you've got enough slack to plug in to the socket. Then we replace it, lining up, and we push down and twist to lock it. All's well seated, and plug in. And that's how you change the thermal paste or replace the CPU on an Intel. Now let's move over to the AMD. The AMD, as I mentioned earlier, we have to remove this bracket. So you unlock it and you unhook from both sides. Unplug, and like with this Intel, pull straight up. Let's get some more tissue and we'll remove the thermal paste. Now, to remove an AMD processor, very similar to the Intel, there's a little arm that you just lift up. The whole socket moves slightly back, which unlocks. Then you can remove the motherboard, the CPU itself. The AMD CPUs have pins on the CPU itself, and it has holes where they all fit into on the motherboard, on the socket. Like with the Intel, there is a little triangular arrow on the CPU which lines up with one on the socket. So we just need to line that up with the one on the socket, press the arm down, and that is the CPU seated properly. Reapplying thermal paste is very similar to the Intel again. Just a small dollop, a pea-sized amount in the centre of the CPU, and then we remount. The heatsink itself, it doesn't matter if you have the arm at the top or the bottom, whichever is easiest for you to access. Just make sure that you can actually plug it in. Again, you need the slack. Then we place the heatsink on the CPU, hook the end that doesn't have the arm on it first, make sure that the arm is unlocked so that we can hook it onto the other side, like so. Then lock it into place. That is how we change the CPU for an AMD and for an Intel, and we apply thermal paste. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how we take out and replace RAM. So the process is very similar, it is exactly the same on both the Intel and the AMD. It doesn't matter what size board you've got. They both have these tabs at the top and usually tabs at the bottom as well. Some of the more modern boards do not have tabs at the bottom, just the ones at the top. But if you unclip those, then the RAM comes straight out. I'll do the same here. 1 and 2. Now, when replacing the RAM, if you have more than 2 slots or you only have a single stick of RAM, it is important to find where you're going to put the RAM. So, if you can see on this board, right under here there is DDR3 1 and DDR3 3, DDR3 2 and DDR3 4 written on the board itself. This is telling you which channels are paired with which. They're also colour coded. So this red one is DDR slot 1, this is DDR slot 2, DDR slot 3 and DDR slot 4. With this one, it would appear, so this is slot 1 and this is slot 2. Now these don't have to be paired because there's only 2 slots, but you will want to put, if you have 1 stick of RAM you put it in this slot, if you have 2 sticks of RAM you obviously put them in both. If you have only 2 sticks of RAM, as we have in this case, you want to use slots 1 and 2. Then if you're adding 2 more, you add it into 3 and 4. Now, to replace the RAM, you'll notice that there is a little notch missing from the RAM stick. All different sized RAM, from DDR1 to DDR4, have the notch in a different place. So you cannot place DDR4 RAM on a DDR3 board, or vice versa. To replace the RAM, you have to line up that notch with a small tab on the DIMM slot itself. So, once you've lined that up and you've got it into the right place, you push down until these 2 clips automatically retract, like so. Do the same with the second slot. Done. And we'll do the same with the AMD board. Again, we're lining up this notch with this little tab here. And then we push down until it clicks into place and locks in place. That is how we replace the RAM on an Intel and an AMD board. DDR4. DDR3. Let's stop the recordings while I find the other RAM.